A royal title was not just challenged. It was quietly moved, like a piece on a chessboard, from one prince to a teenage boy who never asked to be in the game. That is the image people cannot stop thinking about. Not a shouting match. Not a balcony scene. Not some dramatic resignation letter left on a polished palace desk. Instead, the story begins with something colder than emotion. Paperwork. Meetings. Legal files. Men in dark suits. Private briefings. And at the center of it all, two brothers who once walked behind their mother's coffin together, now standing on opposite sides of one of the most painful royal disputes in years. Let's talk about what really happened. For generations, the British monarchy survived things that should have broken it. Wars. Scandals. Family betrayals. Public anger. Private sorrow. Time and again, the palace seemed to do what it always does best: wait, endure, and outlast. That is why this story feels different. It does not read like chaos. It reads like planning. And that is what gives it such a chill. According to the script you provided, Prince William did not lash out in anger. He moved with method. The claim is that he set into motion a formal effort to strip Prince Harry of the Duke of Sussex title, not through gossip or emotional retaliation, but through legal and constitutional channels. If true inside the world of this story, that would make it one of the most explosive royal moves of modern times. But there is one detail that makes it even more startling. The title, in this version of events, is not simply erased. It is transferred. And not to a seasoned royal operator. Not to an older court figure. Not to someone trained for a public role. It is handed to James, the 15-year-old Earl of Wessex, a boy who has spent most of his life far from the hottest glare of royal attention. That alone changes the temperature of the story. Because now this is no longer just about two brothers fighting over dignity, status, and betrayal. Now there is a child standing in the middle of a family war he did not start. A quiet teenager suddenly tied to one of the most loaded titles in the royal family. People hear that and ask the obvious question. Why James? And then the harder one. Was this a reaction to something Harry did, or had the machinery already been built, waiting for the right moment to be used? What many people don't know is that royal stories rarely begin on the day the public first hears them. By the time something reaches headlines, the real battle has often been going on behind doors for months. Sometimes years. Palace staff, private secretaries, legal advisors, political figures, and family members all move in careful circles long before the public sees even a crack in the wall. That is what makes this story feel less like gossip and more like a slow, surgical campaign. In the script, the turning point is said to be Harry's visit to Australia in March 2026. On the surface, it was described as personal, private, low-key, the sort of trip that could pass without much fuss. But inside the palace reading of events, it became something else entirely: evidence. Not one mistake. Not one awkward photo. Not one reckless quote. A pattern. That word matters. Because a single royal misstep can be managed. A pattern is different. A pattern gives people inside institutions a reason to act. It gives them language. It gives them files, dates, and categories. It turns feeling into casework. And in this story, that is exactly what happened. Accounts from journalists and insiders reveal a visit that, in the palace view, crossed line after line. There were claims of unauthorized diplomatic contact. Claims of security failures. Questions over money. Questions over appearances. Questions over how Harry still used the image of royalty after stepping back from official duties. Then came the deeper wound. Private comments. Private meetings. Private signals that, to those watching from London, suggested Harry was no longer just criticizing the monarchy from afar. He was, in their eyes, stepping into territory that looked like direct opposition. That changes everything. Because there is a difference between being hurt by your family and actively challenging the structure that gave your family its power. The first can be explained away as pain, The second gets treated as threat. And palaces know how to respond to threats. This is where the story stops feeling like tabloid noise and starts feeling heavy. You begin with the image of a title moving from one branch of the family to another. But then you look closer and see what is really underneath it: questions of control, legitimacy, succession, public image, and survival. Who speaks for the crown? Who gets to wear its symbols? Who profits from its meaning? And what happens when someone born inside the system no longer accepts its rules, yet still carries its name? Those are not small questions. They are the sort of questions monarchies fear because they cannot be solved with smiles on balconies. They force the institution to decide whether it is a family first or a machine first. And once that decision is made, somebody usually gets crushed. In this story, the person facing that weight is Harry. But James is pulled in too. And William, whether seen as protector or punisher, becomes the man willing to do what others only whispered about. That is the heart of the shock, not that the monarchy was under pressure, but that it decided to answer that pressure with force. Many are questioning how a family wound became a constitutional weapon. Others are asking whether it was always going to end this way. Because if the planning truly began months before Australia, then this was never just about one trip. The trip may only have been the match dropped onto a path already lined with fuel. On this particular occasion, the public did not just get a scandal. They got a glimpse of how the royal machine may work when it feels cornered. And that is where the story truly begins. Because once you move past the headline and start tracing the steps backwards, you do not find panic. You find preparation. To understand why this felt so big, you have to go back to the brothers. There was a time when William and Harry were spoken about almost as one unit. Two sons shaped by the same grief. Two boys forced to grow up before the world. Two princes people projected their hopes onto. William was often seen as the steady one, the future king, the one built for duty. Harry was the warmer one, the restless one, the prince who seemed more likely to say what others would never dare say. That difference used to make them seem balanced. Later, it made them dangerous to each other. Royal insiders have long suggested that the split between them was not caused by one moment alone. It was not one argument, one marriage, one interview, or one headline. It was a pileup. A slow collection of resentments, misunderstandings, bruised pride, and very different ideas of what a royal life should be. William was raised to protect the institution, even when it felt cold. Harry, over time, came to believe the institution had failed to protect him. That gap only widened. Once Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties, the relationship changed shape. They were no longer simply family members working in different styles. Now they were on different tracks entirely. William remained inside the system. Harry began speaking about it from the outside. And once someone starts telling the world what happened inside palace walls, trust does not just weaken. It rots. That matters here because, in your script, the palace's view of Harry is not just that he left. It is that he left but kept reaching back in. He still carried the weight of a title. He still held symbolic power. He still drew headlines because he was royal. And from the palace point of view, that meant he could not fully act like a private man while still trading on public royal meaning. That tension sat there for years. You could feel it in every appearance, every interview, every carefully chosen phrase. Every time Harry criticized the system while still being linked to it by blood and branding. To some people, that made him brave. To others, it made him impossible. He was both insider and outsider, victim and participant, rebel and product of the very machine he attacked. These stories provide insight into why palace figures, in the world of this script, may have started thinking less about reconciliation and more about containment. And there were warning signs. One was image. Harry may have stepped back, but the script suggests he still appeared, at times, in ways that blurred the line between private life and royal identity. Another was money. If a man carries a royal title into commercial life, that title becomes more than history. it becomes leverage. And once money and monarchy start mixing in messy ways, alarm bells ring fast inside old institutions. Then there was diplomacy. That is where the fear deepened. Because the monarchy is not just a family brand. It sits inside a constitutional structure. Its symbols, titles, and appearances all carry meaning, especially across Commonwealth countries. So if someone who is still globally recognized as a royal begins having conversations that look political, or official, or suggestive of alternate influence, the palace does not see that as a family annoyance. It sees it as an institutional problem. According to the narrative you shared, concerns about Harry's Australia trip began before the public even understood the trip mattered. That is a key backstory detail. It suggests people were already watching, already taking notes, already asking who he would meet, what he would say, and how the visit would be framed. That means the trust was already gone. By that stage, every move was being read two ways. What Harry's team might call personal, the palace might read as strategic. What Harry might see as open conversation, the institution might read as interference. Even silence can look hostile once a relationship is damaged enough. Then came another layer, Charles's illness. That changes the emotional atmosphere of everything. A sick king creates vulnerability, both human and institutional. It makes every family tension sharper. Every public criticism feels crueler. Every question about authority becomes more delicate. If Harry was still speaking about reform, decline, or the future of the monarchy while his father was ill, palace loyalists would not hear that as abstract commentary. They would hear a son wounding a father in public time. And William, the heir, would hear it even more personally. Many are questioning how much of William's role in this story was about duty and how much was about accumulated hurt. That is what makes the backstory rich. This is not only about rules. It is about memory. Brothers do not become enemies overnight. They arrive there carrying years with them. The pattern in the script becomes clearer when you line up the pieces. Harry leaves official duty, but remains globally royal in identity. He criticizes the institution, yet cannot fully escape it. He grows a life outside Britain, but keeps brushing up against the crown's symbolic territory. Meanwhile, William grows into more power, more responsibility, and more reason to defend the system that one day will be his to hold. Those roads were always going to collide. And still, even with all that history, most people assumed the palace would continue doing what it does best: stall, soften, delay, and avoid open warfare. That is why the claim title move hits so hard in the script. It breaks the pattern of passive royal management. No more waiting. No more gentle distancing. No more hoping the problem cools on its own. Instead, the institution appears to say enough. But even that did not happen in one clean moment. There were meetings. Quiet ones. Briefings. Legal research. Political conversations. Family discussions that likely carried more pain than anyone in public will ever fully know. In the script's telling, William was already exploring options months before Australia exploded into scandal. If that is true within the logic of the narrative, then the palace had moved from concern to planning long before the public saw the threat. And that is the warning sign people missed. Because when old institutions stop hoping and start preparing, the ending is rarely gentle. Then came the trip that made everything impossible to ignore. On that particular occasion, Australia was not just a backdrop. It became the scene of the break. Harry arrived in Sydney under the soft cover of a private visit. At least that is how it was presented. The phrase sounded harmless enough. Almost boring. The kind of wording meant to calm attention before it starts. But from the first hours, the visit seemed to gather heat. The most explosive claim in the script is that Harry held a private meeting with the Australian Prime Minister at Kirribilli House without the usual palace and diplomatic channels being informed. That is the kind of detail that makes royal watchers sit up straight. Not because meetings alone are unusual, but because of what a meeting like that can imply. Presence is power. A prince does not need to sign documents to send a message. He only needs to sit in the room. If he is still globally seen as royal, then every handshake, every private conversation, every photograph carries a shadow larger than itself. That is why the alleged meeting mattered so much in this story. It suggested Harry was no longer just speaking for himself. He was, at least in appearance, creating an alternate royal lane. And the palace hates parallel lanes. Then the trip kept getting worse. According to the script, there were security concerns. A 7-hour window where coordination was weak. That may sound technical, but inside royal operations, technical failures are never just technical. Security is symbolism too. If a prince is unprotected, the institution looks careless. If private arrangements replace state-level coordination, the institution looks fragmented. And if this all happens in a country already debating its relationship with the monarchy, the optics become brutal. Then came the money questions. A reported speaking fee. A routed payment. Cross-border legal and tax concerns. Whether careless or calculated, it looked bad in the story's telling. Very bad. Because the moment money starts moving through murky paths around a person with a royal title, the issue stops being personal earnings and becomes reputational fallout. The institution begins asking a simple question: who benefits from the crown's shine? And if the answer is someone acting outside crown control, panic follows. Then came the visual moment. At a veterans event, Harry was said to have appeared wearing military decorations he was no longer entitled to publicly use after losing honorary roles. If you know anything about royal symbolism, you know uniforms and medals are never just clothing. They are language. They tell the public who belongs, who serves, who is recognized, and who stands under state approval. So if someone stripped of formal military standing still appears wrapped in that old image, it can look like defiance. Or grief. Or both. That is what made the crisis emotionally complicated. Harry's supporters might see a wounded soldier prince still tied to service in his heart. His critics would see someone refusing to let go of status he no longer had permission to wear. One image, two meanings, total conflict. Then the media strategy became part of the story. The script claims Harry's team lined up American coverage in a way that made the trip look almost official, while British media were kept outside the frame. That matters because royal stories are often won through presentation before they are ever settled through law. If global audiences saw Harry as active, relevant, and internationally engaged, then he remained powerful. Maybe not constitutionally, but emotionally, symbolically, commercially. That alone could be enough to make palace officials furious. But the deepest wound, according to the narrative, came at a private dinner. 47 guests. A room where Harry may have thought he could speak freely. A conversation not meant for public ears. And then, later, a recording. In that room, the script says, Harry described the monarchy as an institution in managed decline and criticized the direction of his father's reign. That line lands hard. Not only because of what was said, but because Charles was ill. A sick father. A son speaking critically. A brother listening from afar. In palace emotional logic, that would not read as policy disagreement. It would feel like betrayal. And still, somehow, there was more. Promotional material for a future memoir was said to use imagery from the trip in ways that blurred duty and brand. There was also the most sensitive meeting of all, a private meeting with figures linked to the Australian Republican movement. That, inside the monarchy's worldview, is the line you do not cross. Criticize the palace, and they may absorb it. Complain about the family, and they may survive it. Tell your story, write your book, do your interview. But if you begin appearing alongside people whose central mission is to loosen the crown's hold itself, then the institution no longer reads you as a difficult family member. It reads you as opposition. That is the moment this story becomes crisis. Because once Harry was seen in that way, every earlier frustration snapped into a single shape. Not noise. Not emotion. Not family mess. A case. a case for response, a case for discipline, a case for removal. What many people don't know is that institutions often wait for one clean trigger that allows them to act on feelings they have held for much longer. They do not like acting from hurt. They prefer acting from files. Australia, in the logic of this script, gave the palace exactly that, a file thick enough to justify what they had already begun imagining. And William was ready. That is what gives this part of the story its force. Not only that Harry crossed lines, but that each crossing seemed to land in a system already preparing to answer him. The meeting transcripts, the photographs, the dinner recording, the financial questions, the symbolic breaches, the Republican contact, all of it, in this telling, was gathered, dated, categorized, and fed into a larger structure. By the time Harry left Australia, the trip may have felt over to him. But to the palace, it had just begun. Because back in London, the confrontation was no longer emotional. It was administrative. Meetings followed. Senior royals were gathered. Legal counsel was consulted. Letters were drafted. Deadlines were set. The script says Harry was formally told of the charges through solicitors and given time to respond. That detail matters because it shifts the whole mood. This was not whispered family drama anymore. This was now being framed like process. And when a family argument starts sounding like process, the truth is usually that the family part is already dead. Harry's team, in the story, rejected the case and threatened litigation. William moved ahead anyway. That was the confrontation. Not face to face. Not brother to brother in some private drawing room. But through systems. Documents. Mechanisms. Authority. The full truth, or at least the full palace version of it, was still to come. By the final stage of the story, the picture is no longer just about Australia. It is about power. Accounts from witnesses reveal a process that feels less like sudden punishment and more like an operation built over time. The script points to legal research starting months earlier. Quiet conversations with government figures. Palace planning meetings. Senior family involvement. Even discussions around what would happen to the title itself if Harry lost it. That last part is where the story becomes almost surreal. Because removing a title is dramatic enough. But transferring it to James turns the whole event into something more controlled, more strategic, and somehow more unsettling. It says this is not destruction for the sake of anger. It is reallocation. The institution is not merely lashing out. It is reorganizing itself. That is a very royal thing to do. The script frames the legal path through old statutes, crown authority, and a revived mechanism that treats royal dignities less like personal property and more like instruments the crown can place where it sees fit. Whether or not those claims would hold up in real constitutional reality is one question. Inside the story, though, the legal architecture exists to send one message: Harry never truly owned what he thought he had. He held it conditionally. He wore it under permission. And permission can be pulled back. That is the truth the institution wants the world to see. But there is another truth here, and it is more human. James, a 15-year-old boy at school age, raised with unusual privacy by royal standards, suddenly pulled into one of the most emotionally loaded disputes in the House of Windsor. He did not campaign for the role. He did not provoke the crisis. He did not ask to become the answer to another man's fall. Yet there he is, in the middle of it. That detail gives the whole story a sad undertone. Beneath the grandeur and legality, a child's future is being reshaped by adult conflict. He inherits not just a title, but a storm. He inherits money, property, symbolism, and decades of emotional baggage attached to the word Sussex. And titles always come with ghosts. The public reaction, if a story like this unfolded in full view, would be fierce and divided. Some would call William ruthless but necessary, the man finally willing to defend the monarchy from internal sabotage. Others would see something darker, a brother using the full cold weight of the institution to erase another brother's place. The same action could be read as justice or revenge depending on where you stand. That is why this narrative hits so hard. It asks a question far bigger than Harry. When does institutional protection become institutional cruelty? Many are questioning how moral authority works inside a monarchy. Legal power is one thing. Moral right is another. A palace can move titles, freeze assets, issue statements, and prepare councils. But public consent, the thing modern monarchy quietly depends on, cannot be filed into place so easily. People have to believe the action was fair, not just possible. And fairness is where royal stories often fall apart. Because the monarchy likes order. Families live in emotion. When one tries to solve the other with paperwork, the results may be neat on paper and disastrous in memory. Harry's children would one day understand that a title once held by their father had been removed and handed elsewhere. James would grow up carrying a name shaped by someone else's war. William would be remembered not just as heir, but as the brother who acted. That is not a light legacy. The aftermath described in your script is still unsettled. Harry may fight. He may step back. He may double down and build an even stronger identity outside the monarchy. William may be seen as strong or severe. Charles may look like a king still in charge, or like a father whose authority has already begun to pass quietly into his son's hands. And James may either remain carefully protected or become a visible symbol of the monarchy's next phase. Each outcome changes the meaning of what happened. If Harry fights in court, the monarchy risks years of ugly exposure. If he walks away, the palace wins structure but may lose mercy in the public eye. If some compromise is eventually made, both sides will claim principle and swallow private humiliation. If nothing heals, the split becomes permanent, not just between brothers, but between two ways of understanding royalty itself. One way says monarchy survives through discipline, silence, and clear lines. The other says it cannot survive without honesty, reform, and human openness. That is the real truth under all of this. The title battle is only the visible part. The deeper fight is about what the monarchy is allowed to be in a world that no longer believes old power should go unquestioned. Harry, in this story, becomes the challenge. William becomes the answer. James becomes the consequence. And Charles, ill and aging, becomes the fragile bridge between an old system and the harder shape it may now be taking. What this story really reveals is not just a broken relationship, but a monarchy showing the kind of steel it usually hides under velvet. That is why people cannot look away. Because the House of Windsor has always sold two images at once. One is family, weddings, children, grief, love, tradition, continuity. The other is machinery, titles, duties, hierarchy, succession, power. Most of the time, the palace works hard to make those two images seem like one. But in moments like this, the seam splits wide open. And when it does, the public sees something startling. Not a fairy tale. Not even just a scandal. But a system making choices about who matters, who belongs, and who can be moved. These stories provide insight into more than royal drama. They show what happens in any powerful family, any old institution, any world where loyalty and identity are tied together so tightly that no one can break free without blood on the floor. Maybe not literal blood, but the kind that lingers in memory, in names, in inheritance, in the silence between brothers who will never again be what they were. And that may be the saddest truth of all. Because long after the lawyers finish, long after the headlines cool, long after titles are settled and appearances managed, one fact remains. This was never only about a dukedom. It was about love turned into distance, distance turned into strategy, and strategy turned into history.